The kettle began to whistle just as the sun broke through the blinds. Mornings were my quiet ritual coffee grounds, measured to the last spoonful. One slice of toast. The small kitchen window opened toward the sound of gulls from the Cape Fear River. I was Liora Bramwell, 72 years old, retired housekeeper, part-time seamstress, and a woman who had learned that peace only lasts as long as you guard it. Steam curled from my cup as I reached for my phone, more out of habit than curiosity. A single notification blinked across the screen, shared post, trending locally. I tapped it, expecting a recipe or a photo from the church bazaar. Instead, the image that filled my screen stopped my breath. My daughter, Yone, stood in a simple white dress, holding a bouquet of magnolias. Beside her, Pierce Calloway grinned, one arm around her waist. Behind them were his parents, Franklin and Eleanor, faces beaming in a way that felt rehearsed. The caption below the photo read, "Family complete." For a moment, I thought there had been a mistake. Maybe an engagement, a styled shoot. Anything but what it was. Then I saw the silver band on her hand, the confetti at their feet, the minister in the corner of the frame. It was a wedding, my daughter's wedding, and I had not been invited. The kettle kept screaming until I turned off the burner. I held the phone in my hand as if it were something sharp. No call. No text. Not even a message afterward. Just a photo on a public feed, liked and shared by neighbors who still waved when I passed them on the sidewalk. My thumb trembled as I deleted the app, watching the icon vanish like a closing door. The house fell quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat down at the kitchen table, the wood still warm from the sunlight, and waited for the shock to settle into something I could name. I had given her everything, my years, my hands, my savings, but somehow, respect had never made the list. Outside, a gull cried over the river. I poured another cup of coffee and stared at the empty chair across from me, knowing I would have to decide what came next. After the photo, I couldn't bring myself to leave the kitchen. The coffee had gone cold, but I held the cup anyway, tracing the rim with my thumb. The morning light had shifted to a soft gold that made the dust in the air look like tiny falling stars. I used to love this hour when the day still felt possible. After Elijah died, mornings were the hardest. He had been gone nearly 30 years now, and still I caught myself listening for his boots by the back door, the slow creak of his chair. He was a quiet man, but his silence had never hurt. Mine did, when he passed. I took whatever work I could find. Houses in the historic district paid best. I scrubbed baseboards for the Rodwells, polished silver for the Tanners, and kept my back straight no matter how tired my legs felt. It was honest work, though not the kind of life I had imagined when I was young. Every paycheck went into a jar on the top shelf of the pantry, the jar that became our safety, our hope. Years later, when Ione started college, I used that jar to make a down payment on a small bungalow on Leona Street. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a porch that faced the magnolia trees, but it was solid. I bought it through a land trust so she could one day take it over without debt. I told her it was my way of keeping her safe, though maybe it was my way of staying close. I remember painting the walls pale blue, the color she loved as a child. Every nail, every stroke of paint carried a wish that she'd feel proud, that she'd never see her mother as less. When she teased me about my old cleaning uniform, I'd laugh, pretending it didn't sting. "Mama, you don't have to keep working," she'd say. But I did. I wanted her life to be clean of struggle, even if mine stayed stained by it. Sometimes I still hear Elijah's voice when I walk through the empty rooms. Never give away what they haven't learned to respect. The phone screen lit up again on the counter, her wedding photo faintly glowing. I turned it face down and let the room grow quiet. That evening, I waited for my phone to ring. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer to listen. I called once, twice, 3 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. I left no message, just listened to the sound of her recorded voice. Bright and hurried, the same way she used to sound when running late for class. After the 3rd try, I sent a short message. "Are you all right?" The reply came hours later. "Busy. Mama, we'll talk later." I read it again and again. Those 5 words that felt like a door closing gently but firmly. The warmth that used to live between us had thinned over the years. I scrolled through our old conversations, birthday photos, grocery reminders, little hearts she used to send just because, lately, her texts had become clipped, her sentences all edges. By morning, the silence had hardened into something heavy. I stepped outside to water the small patch of camellias near the porch. Across the fence, my neighbor, Mrs. Ellery, waved her watering can in greeting. She was 80, sharp-eyed, always knowing what went on before anyone else did. "I saw the prettiest wedding pictures on X last night," she said, smiling. "Your Ione looked just like a movie star. That Callaway boy sure comes from fine stock." I nodded because my throat wouldn't let me speak. Her voice drifted on about the flowers, the dress, the crowd of elegant guests. By the time she finished, my hands were shaking so badly I had to set the hose down. Everyone had seen the photos. Everyone but me. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish. I opened the drawer in Ione's old desk, the one she'd used for college applications. Under a stack of old notebooks, I found an envelope with my name written in her teenage handwriting. The paper was pink, the ink fading but still careful. "You'll always be the most important person in my life," it read. "No matter how far I go, you'll be my home." I folded the letter back along its worn creases and sat for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, and the silence that now carried her name. The morning after Mrs. Ellery's cheerful gossip, I woke with the kind of headache that comes from too much remembering. The air was heavy with summer rain, the kind that made the river smell like iron and salt. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the folder I hadn't opened in years, the one marked Liona Street Trust. Inside were brittle copies of deeds, notarized letters, and payment receipts written in my careful hand. I read through them slowly, the way I used to read bedtime stories to Ione, each line meant to protect her future. Then I reached the clause I had almost forgotten the property remained in my name until she provided a written acknowledgement and a symbolic payment to finalize transfer. Neither had ever come. I remembered the day we signed it. She had laughed, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Mama, this is so old-fashioned," she said. "Nobody does symbolic payments anymore." I told her it wasn't about money. It was about respect, about understanding what it meant to receive something earned through years of other people's houses and other people's messes. She kissed my cheek and said she understood. She never followed through. I gathered the papers and placed them in my purse. By mid-morning, I was sitting in the small law office above the pharmacy on Market Street. The young attorney, Crispin Lyle, looked surprised to see me after so many years. His uncle had been one of my clients when I used to clean the firm's offices every Friday. He adjusted his glasses as he read through the trust. "Mrs. Bramwell," he said carefully, "you're still the legal owner. Everything is in your name until those terms are met." He paused. "And that gives you choices." The words settled inside me like a steady breath. Choices. When I left the office, the rain had stopped. The pavement shone like fresh ink, and I held the folder close against my chest. The weight of it was strange, lighter than guilt, heavier than peace, but for the first time in years, it felt like mine. That night, I made tomato soup and set the table for one. The smell of basil filled the small kitchen. Warm and steady, I opened my old notebook, the one I had used to track grocery lists and bills, and turned to a blank page. At the top, I wrote 3 words in careful block letters. Plan for independence. Beneath it, I began a list. 1, assess assets. 2, check standing offers. 3, prepare notice. The pen scratched softly across the paper, the sound more comforting than any conversation I could have imagined with my daughter. I had waited most of my life for other people to make choices. That night, I began making my own. The next morning, I dressed neatly. In the navy blouse Elijah once said brought out the color in my eyes, and walked to the bank downtown. The teller directed me to a man named Mr. Lawson, a middle-aged advisor with a calm voice and kind manners. I had known his mother years ago. She used to bring me her curtains to him. He studied my records carefully, nodding as he flipped through the statements. Mrs. Bramwell, you've been remarkably prudent, he said. You have no debts, steady savings, and the trust property itself is substantial. You're in a strong position. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to me that way, as if I were competent, not fragile. I thanked him and left with a printed summary of my accounts tucked inside my purse, the numbers grounding me in quiet proof of what my life's labor had built. At home, I found the card for Bayline Realty, a firm that had contacted me months before about the bungalow. The agent, a woman named Sabrina Clark, answered on the second ring. Mrs. Bramwell, we'd still be honored to make an offer. She said. We spoke for less than 15 minutes. By the end of the call, the agreement was set, a clean sale, closing in 10 business days. I hung up the phone, drew a line through the 3rd step in my notebook, and exhaled slowly. The soup pot was still on the stove. I stirred it once and let the warmth rise to meet me. They came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the sky over Charleston looked like linen stretched thin by salt and light. I heard the car door close. Then Ione's laugh, brighter than I remembered, practiced in its ease. When I opened the door, she was standing there with Pierce beside her, tanned and polished from their honeymoon. Mama, she said, hugging me as if the world hadn't shifted. We wanted to tell you in person. Pierce smiled, holding out a paper bag printed with seashells and anchors. From Savannah, he said. We thought you'd like a souvenir. I led them to the kitchen. The table was already set with sweet tea and the good glasses, the ones I used to bring out for birthdays. Ione talked quickly about the ceremony, about how perfect the weather had been, about Pierce's parents arranging everything at the chapel. Her words sparkled like beads rolling off a string, too smooth to catch. I listened, nodded, poured tea. Not once did I say I'd seen the pictures before she ever called. I let her version stand, neat and polished. Pierce spoke little, only smiled and complimented the house. It still looks just like I remember, he said. I almost answered that some things hold their shape only because no one touches them anymore. But I didn't. After 2 hours of bright conversation and pauses that filled the space between us, they stood to leave. Ione kissed my cheek lightly. We'll have you over soon, Mama, once we're settled. I smiled and walked them to the porch. When their car disappeared down the street, the silence fell like dust. Back inside, I emptied the bag onto the table. A few small seashells rolled out, chipped and dull, the kind sold by the handful to tourists. I stared at them for a long time before sweeping them gently into a glass bowl. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote a single line in my notebook. If she can live without including me, I can live without waiting. The words steadied me more than prayer ever had. Tomorrow, I would sign the papers. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of sterile air that made everything feel temporary. I sat beside Crispin Lyle at the long oak table, my hands folded around a small handkerchief that once belonged to Elijah. Across the aisle sat Ione and Pierce, flanked by a lawyer in a tailored gray suit. Ione looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders rounded as if the weight of the room had settled on her. Pierce, by contrast, was all sharp edges, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. The injunction had come 2 days earlier. Family expectation. The papers claimed. As if love were a legal right. They wanted to stop the sale of the bungalow, arguing that my intention had always been to give it to Ione. When the judge entered, the room stilled. I could hear the low hum of the fluorescent lights above, steady and indifferent. The Callaway's lawyer spoke first. He presented a printed text from years ago, my words. "Someday this house will be yours." He read it aloud as though it were a signed contract. "This clearly demonstrates Mrs. Bramwell's intent to transfer ownership," he said. "Our clients acted in good faith, believing the property was theirs in spirit, if not yet in title." Crispin stood calmly. "Intent," he said, "is not transfer." He opened a folder and laid out the documents one by one, the trust agreement, the unfulfilled clause, the unsigned acknowledgement. Mrs. Bramwell's generosity is not in question, but the law recognizes action, not assumption. The judge reviewed everything quietly, his glasses slipping down his nose. After several long minutes, he spoke. "The property remains under Mrs. Bramwell's name. The sale may proceed. No damages will be awarded. This court acknowledges no breach of obligation beyond what the written terms define." The gavel struck once. Ione's eyes glistened, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Pierce kept his gaze on the floor. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light felt sharp after the dimness inside. Crispin walked beside me, holding the folder under his arm. "You didn't win, Mrs. Bramwell," he said softly. "You just stopped losing." I nodded, feeling something loosen quietly inside my chest, something too small to be triumph, but enough to breathe again. 2 mornings after the hearing, the moving truck pulled up to the curb. The driver was young and polite, calling me ma'am each time he carried a box through the door. I had labeled everything carefully: Ione's room, books, photographs, linens, and watched as years of life were wrapped, stacked, and tied in clean white rope. The rooms began to hollow out quickly. Without the furniture, the walls looked taller, unfamiliar. I stood in the doorway of what had once been Ione's bedroom and heard the faint echo of her laughter, the kind that used to fill the hall when she and her friends stayed over after prom or finals week. The sound felt like it belonged to someone else's memory now. By noon, the house was nearly empty. I gave the movers the address of the storage unit downtown and handed the foreman a folded check. "Keep the boxes dry," I said. He nodded, kind enough not to comment on the tremor in my voice. Later that afternoon, at the grocery store, I ran into Mrs. Howland, a woman from church who was never unkind but never gentle either. She had heard about the sale before I opened my mouth. "I'd never sell my child's home," she said, clutching her basket like a shield. "That seems so final." I held her gaze and replied softly, "Maybe your child still remembers where home is." Her lips parted, but she didn't answer. I walked away before my composure could crack. That night, I heated the last of the tomato soup and sat at the kitchen counter, the only piece of furniture left. The spoon clinked against the bowl, steady and slow. Tears came. Quiet at first, then steady as rain. I let them fall. It wasn't grief alone. It was the release that follows a long captivity, the strange lightness of knowing you've chosen yourself. The house stood bare around me, its emptiness both wound and balm. And for the first time in years, the silence felt honest. The apartment overlooked the Cape Fear River, its windows catching the morning light in soft ribbons. It was smaller than the bungalow 1-bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a balcony just wide enough for a chair and a pot of basil, but it felt open in a way that space alone couldn't measure. I unpacked slowly, one box at a time, letting each object earn its place. Within a week, I found a rhythm. On Mondays, I joined a small reading circle at the public library, where women my age gathered around dog-eared novels and homemade cookies. On Wednesdays, I learned Tai Chi in the park. The movements were slow and foreign at first, but the air off the river felt clean against my skin, and my body began to remember what calm felt like. One morning, after class, I met Mr. Alexander. He was a retired boat builder with hands still calloused from years of shaping wood. We shared a bench overlooking the water, talking about tide patterns and weather, about nothing that required defense or memory. Sometimes he brought a thermos of coffee. Sometimes we just watched the boats pass in silence. At home, I placed a single framed photograph on the mantel. It wasn't of family or faces, just the river at dawn, the light soft and wide over the water. It reminded me that beauty could exist without belonging to anyone. That evening, as I set my phone to charge, a message appeared on the screen. "We're sorry. We didn't mean to hurt you. It was from Ione." I read it twice, the words trembling between apology and habit. After a moment, I typed back, "Hurt ends where honesty begins." I set the phone down and stepped onto the balcony. The air smelled of salt and rain, the tide murmuring below. Somewhere across the river, a church bell rang the hour. I stood there until the sound faded, holding the cool railing, feeling both the distance and the peace I had finally made room for. It was late spring when Ione came to Wilmington alone. I saw her through the glass door before she knocked her posture smaller, her expression stripped of the bright certainty she once wore like armor. In her hands, she carried a cream-colored envelope, folded and creased from being opened too many times. "Hi, Mama," she said softly. Her voice trembled on the word she used to throw around so easily. "I wrote something. I thought maybe you'd want to read it." I stepped aside and let her in. The apartment smelled of lemon polish and river air. She sat at the small table while I poured tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup as if gathering courage. When I opened the letter, her handwriting was uneven, some words rewritten over faint smudges. She wrote about fear of not belonging, of trying too hard to be accepted by people who measured worth in money and manners. She admitted she'd let pride decide where love should fit, and that she'd built a life where I didn't seem to match the furniture. She didn't ask forgiveness. She simply said she finally understood what it meant to be loved without condition, and to lose it through carelessness. When I finished reading, I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside my cup. "You've grown," I said. It was the only truth that fit the air between us. She nodded, her eyes wet but steady. We didn't plan a reunion or speak of the past. Instead, we shared quiet tea, the kind where forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken aloud. When she left, I watched her cross the street toward the river, her steps slow but certain. That evening, I took a small brass plaque from the drawer, a piece I had ordered weeks before. I mounted it just inside the door, where light from the window would touch it each morning. The engraving was simple, "Home by Respect." As I stepped back to look at it, the words caught the last gold of daylight. Peace, I realized, isn't surrender, it's maintenance.